He has focused on pedestrian-oriented designs as a senior walkable communities advisor at Victoria Walks. Dwayne has recently completed extensive research on mixing pedestrians and cyclists on shared paths. He will outline these issues and infrastructure options that work for both walking and cycling. Please welcome Dwayne.
So Victoria Walks really started to get interested in shared paths when we did our research on seniors and walking. We commissioned Dr. Jan Garrard, who's a well-known cycling and walking researcher from Deakin University, to look at the issues of seniors and walking. And that involved quite a significant literature review, an analysis of the VISTA transport data, a pretty major survey with over 1,000 seniors responding, and focus groups. And there's a link there, you can see that research is available on our website. And we saw from those results, when we asked seniors what were the impediments that they faced when they were walking, one of the sort of more significant ones that came up was bicycle riders on shared walking and cycling paths. About 39% of them said that it was a moderate or major constraint to their walking. And you can see there were obviously some other significant ones as well, with dogs off leash or out of control being number one. But when we asked them also what could we do to make walking safer, this is when we really started to notice cycling coming up as an issue, because better cyclist behaviour on shared paths and reduced cycling speed on shared paths were the top two responses we got back. So we realised at that point that there was a significant issue for seniors in sharing shared paths with cyclists. And the focus groups really kind of just provided a bit of life to that finding, I suppose, just confirmed that finding. Here's a couple of quotes there. And I think the bottom quote certainly illustrates the issue. This notion that you have to share has to come with more thought. And I guess that's what we look to do with our research, is to think more about shared paths and get a deeper understanding of where they work and where they don't work. The issue was confirmed for us too when we started doing some work for Vision Australia on a road safety audit tool for pedestrians who were vision impaired. And the first part of that work that was done by Vision Australia was a study that was done by Newark, where they actually surveyed about 600 people with vision impairment and about their experience in walking in the community. And about 8% had been involved in a collision and 20% in a near collision in a 5-year period. So really high rate of collision and near collision for that community. And about a quarter of those collisions or near collisions were with bikes. And they also surveyed vision impaired people about different situations that they face when they're walking in the community, and the situation where they had the lowest level of confidence was in interacting with cyclists. Vision impaired pedestrians have generally low level of confidence in most situations. The only situation they are confident with is crossing at traffic lights. So we determined to undertake some research on shared paths. So what we did was a literature review of the research that's available, with a particular focus on the Australian material. We had some discussion with some subject experts, and we also consulted with councils. MAV facilitated that, and we had about 18 councils provide feedback to us on the first draft of the paper. And what you see is that the vision for the original vision for shared paths is not really matching the reality. So this diagram is kind of complicated, obviously, but what it basically says, this is from Ostroad's Guide to Road Design. What it basically says, and it's a flow diagram that helps you choose your infrastructure. what infrastructure you use for what situation. So it basically says that you should use shared paths where the pedestrian or cyclist volume is low, and they're talking really low, about 10 cyclists per hour, or 10 users per hour, or cyclist speeds are below 20 kilometres per hour. So it's a vision of shared paths as really low use or low speed. But in practice, we are getting that in some places, but not in all places. And certainly for our busier shared paths, it's quite a different situation. So about 3/4 of our recreational paths on the Metropolitan Trail Network, which were intended for leisure use, are now hired transport use. And as part of our research, we looked at the available data that was out there about how fast cyclists were travelling on shared paths, and it varies a lot between users and between paths and between points on paths. But as a general rule, cyclists are travelling between 20 and 30 kilometres per hour on shared paths. That's the sort of average. And obviously, 20 to 30 kilometres per hour is faster than 20 kilometres per hour or less that Australians envisaged. And there's some really interesting studies out there about shared paths. A lot of studies were done that were observational studies. People watch a path for a certain amount of time, and those studies almost always, or there's some exceptions, but they almost always conclude that there's no problem. Because when you watch the path, you don't see a problem. But the user experience of those paths is quite different. So when people have been surveyed, they often perceive a conflict or report a conflict. And so you get results, for example, like a survey of walkers on Sydney foreshore, where 8% have been knocked over by cyclists, and 33% have been frightened by one. And interestingly, from the cyclist perspective, there was one focus group where all the cyclists basically reported being involved in a collision or a near miss. And probably for that reason, when you survey cyclists on what sort of infrastructure they like, and VicRoads did some research on different sort of shared path configurations versus segregated paths and so on. And about 7% of cyclists said that they really like travelling on shared paths. They kind of like shared paths generally because it's not cycling on the road. But in terms of really liking shared paths, only 7% said they did. Whereas a segregated path, 66% said that they really like cycling in that context. Now, I'm just going to talk a bit about perceptions of shared paths. It's quite important how shared paths are perceived. And there's a bit of an issue in that, in some contexts, shared paths are described as cycle paths, even by the asset managers, the councils that manage it. And describing shared paths as a bike path is really problematic. What we know is that people are unclear, relatively speaking, about the legal requirement to give way, for cyclists to give way to pedestrians on shared paths. And there was an interesting study in Sydney where they looked at a range of different shared paths. And only one of those paths had more cyclists than walkers. Typically there were more walkers than cyclists. But it was really interesting that the response of the users to that situation. So on the path where there were more cyclists than walkers, more than half of walkers who met a cyclist took evasive action. And generally that meant either moving to the side of the path, or moving off the path altogether. Remembering, of course, that theoretically it's the cyclist that should be taking evasive action to move around the walker. But that level of evasion on that particular path was between 3 and 45 times the amount of evasion that by pedestrians that took place on other paths. So in other words, on other paths, the pedestrians weren't seeing the need to get out of the way of the bikes. But when they were on a path where there were more cyclists than walkers, they felt the need to get out of the way. And some of the implications can be significant. So, and it really goes to the pedestrian's role in the shared path and pedestrians being marginalised on shared paths. So this is an example of a man who was at a tram stop in Northcote. He walked onto the shared path and hit by a cyclist, and the police report says that he walked onto a bike path. The implication being that he sort of stepped out onto the road kind of thing, or walked into an environment he shouldn't have been in, but in fact he was just walking on a shared path. Now I'm going to start talking a little bit about so what do we do in response to this situation, and one of the responses that we've seen is converting footpaths into shared paths, and that's particularly problematic for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they're not fit for purpose. They're not designed as shared paths. They don't generally meet the shared path standards. For reasons we've seen before, it's intimidating for walkers, and particularly more vulnerable ones, and it's often confusing because you get situations where, like this one here, where this cyclist was really required to dismount and they go across that pedestrian crossing, but they've got a shared path leading up to that crossing, so of course they'll just continue on their bike and smile for the camera. So what do we do about solutions? Now clearly, managing behaviour on shared paths is an important thing to try and do, and we need to reinforce the fact that there's a legal requirement for cyclists to give way to pedestrians. We need to communicate that simple fact clearly in our signage and so on. And we need to say to cyclists that they should slow down on shared paths. But the reality is we don't really have any way of controlling cycling speed on shared paths. We don't have the same mechanisms for controlling cyclists that we do for cars on the road. And if our objective is to encourage both walking and cycling, we don't particularly want cyclists to be slowing down either. We want to provide them with the capacity to move quickly if they're cycling for transport. And what it comes down to really is that much like if you've got a road, if you need a sign to tell people to slow down on the road, if you need a sign to tell people to slow down on a shared path, then you've probably designed your path wrong, or got the wrong type of path. So we're advocating for a greater use of separated paths. That's generally what happens in Europe. And obviously Europe is the model in terms of high rates of walking and cycling. We have a bit of an issue in Victoria in that the Victorian guidelines don't say that we should have, or don't definitively recommend that we should have separated paths unless we have very high numbers of cyclists, over 600 per hour at the peak. And that's actually that's not consistent with other guidance like the Queensland guidance, and it's also inefficient. Once you get to high numbers of walkers and cyclists, you actually get more efficient movement on separated paths of the same width than you do on a shared path. So we've reached the conclusion that we should be looking at separated paths where we've got a situation where there's more than 50 cyclists per hour in the peak hour. The peak hour is important, I think, because it's the commuter cyclists that we're most concerned about in terms of large volumes, rather than sort of slow speed recreational cyclists. And that number of 50 is roughly reconciled with the guidance in some of the European countries like Norway and the Netherlands. Just a note on the growth areas. We're certainly advocating that in the growth areas we should either have low-speed environments where cyclists can safely ride on the road, or they should have separated off-road paths. We think there's room for them. This is an example of how that could work. This is one of the precinct structure plans from Wyndham, where there's a separated cycle path. But ironically, in the same precinct structure plan, they're advocating shared paths on primary arterials with a road reserve greater than 40 metres. We've certainly been having some conversations with Vic Roads about this, and to start with, that was a little bit frustrating in that we're being told there's not enough room for separated bike paths and footpaths in a road reserve which is more than 40 metres wide. But we're hopeful that that Vic Roads have come round to the view that separated paths and footpaths are the way to go rather than shared paths. So just to sort of sum up, we would say avoid shared paths as your infrastructure choice where there are many elderly or pedestrians with vision impairment, where you've got large numbers of walkers. Probably the number there is around 100 per hour, and where you've got a lot of commuter cyclists, more than 50 per hour. And to give you some context around that, there would still be a lot of shared paths. The majority of shared paths would have less than 50 cyclists per hour. So there is a place for shared paths, but once you get to higher numbers of cyclists, then we really think there should be separated paths. And for cyclists, it's really about giving them separated off-road facilities or safer roads with low speed conditions. So we're just sort of preparing to release this research now. We've got a position statement, short 4-page position statement, which is available on our website already. We've got a larger research paper which sort of documents the whole study, which will also be on the website. In fact, it's already there, but we're still playing with the graphic design, so it might look a little bit different next week. And that's it. Thank you.